The chainsaw blade bit through the stop work order sign like it was paper, sending splinters flying across my half-built deck. Victoria Ashworth stood 30 feet away, phone pressed to her ear, screaming over the noise, "Officer, he's destroying official documents." What Victoria didn't know, those documents were as fake as her smile, and I'd been waiting 3 years for her to finally cross this line. See, I'd been planning this moment since the day she tried to fine me for my truck's paint being aesthetically inappropriate. Turns out, when you own the entire lake, she's been charging people to access. The game changes pretty fast. Ever dealt with a neighbor who thinks they run the entire world? Drop your HOA horror stories below, because I guarantee none of them can top what Victoria Ashworth put our community through. But before we get to how she lost her house, her authority, and $47,000 in one afternoon, let me tell you how this war actually started. My name's Marcus Kellerman, and 3 years ago, I inherited something that changed my life forever. Not money, not stocks, but a small piece of lakefront property in Cedar Falls, Colorado that my grandfather left me. I'm a former Marine Corps engineer turned software consultant. And after my wife Sarah lost her battle with cancer in 2021, I needed somewhere quiet to heal. The plan was simple. Build a modest cabin where I could work remotely and find some peace by the water. Grandpa used to bring me fishing here when I was a kid, telling stories about the old days when neighbors actually looked out for each other instead of trying to control them. The property sits on the eastern shore of Cedar Falls Lake, surrounded by 30 other homes, in what the real estate agents call an upscale lakefront community. Beautiful place. Really. 47 acres of pristine mountain water, reflecting the Colorado peaks, with custom homes ranging from $500,000 to $2 million. The kind of neighborhood where people move to escape city stress and enjoy the country club lifestyle. That's where Victoria Ashworth comes in. And trust me, she's a piece of work. Victoria moved to Cedar Falls in 2019 after what she calls being downsized from her position as a Wells Fargo branch manager. 52 years old, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of smile that never quite reaches her eyes. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd somehow gotten herself elected HOA president, promising to maintain community standards and property values. What she really meant was turning our peaceful neighborhood into her personal kingdom. From day one, Victoria ran that HOA like she was managing a military compound. Every resident got a binder thick as a phone book outlining her rules, approved paint colors, acceptable landscaping, proper dock specifications, even regulations about what vehicles could be parked in driveways. And the fees? $200 per year for something she called lake access maintenance, which supposedly covered keeping the water clean and the shoreline pristine. Most neighbors paid without question because, hey, who wants to fight the HOA? I learned about Victoria's management style real quick. First week after moving in, she knocked on my door with a violation notice because my pickup truck was forest green instead of an approved earth tone. Next month, she cited me for letting my grass grow half an inch too tall. Then came the big one. A formal complaint because my inherited dock extended 2 feet further into the water than her newly revised regulations allowed. Each violation came with a fine, each fine came with a deadline, and each deadline came with threats of legal action if I didn't comply immediately. But I'm not the type to make waves unnecessarily, so I paid the fines and made the changes. Victoria's power trip was obvious, but I had bigger things to worry about. Working through grief, building a new life, trying to honor Sarah's memory by finding joy again. Victoria Ashworth's petty tyranny seemed manageable compared to what I'd already survived. That changed the day I filed my building permit with Boulder County. I'd spent months designing a sample 1,200 square foot cabin. Nothing fancy. Just a place to work and think with a view of the water where Grandpa and I used to fish. I followed every code, hired a licensed architect, and submitted proper paperwork to the county planning department. Standard procedure. Right? Wrong? Apparently. Nobody told me that in Victoria's world, Boulder County permits were just suggestions. She appeared at my property at exactly 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carrying her signature clipboard and wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Marcus Kellerman," she announced like she was serving a warrant. "We need to discuss your unauthorized construction project." I was sitting on my tailgate drinking coffee and reviewing the day's plans when Hurricane Victoria made landfall. Morning. Victoria, what can I do for you? I kept my voice friendly, even though her tone had already set my teeth on edge. She consulted her clipboard with the seriousness of a federal prosecutor reading charges. This cabin project violates 17 separate provisions of our community covenants. I'm here to inform you that construction must cease immediately. I took another sip of coffee and waited for her to elaborate. Victoria loved an audience for her authority displays. First, she continued, all residential structures in Cedar Falls must be minimum 2,000 square feet. Your proposed cabin falls significantly below that standard. She clicked her pen against the clipboard like a teacher scolding a misbehaving student. Second, architectural style must be consistent with existing homes. This rustic design conflicts with our established aesthetic. I pulled out my county-approved building plans and spread them on the tailgate. Victoria, I've got proper permits here. County says everything's legal. Her face flushed red, and I caught a glimpse of the real Victoria Ashworth underneath the professional facade. County permits are irrelevant. I have emergency committee powers to protect community interests. She reached into her blazer and produced an official-looking document with multiple signatures and an embossed seal. This authorization allows me to override external permits when community welfare is threatened. Emergency committee powers? I'd never heard of such a thing. But the document looked impressive enough. Victoria was clearly prepared for this confrontation, and I was starting to realize she'd been planning it since the day I submitted my permit application. What exactly is this emergency committee? I asked, genuinely curious about the legal framework she was claiming. Victoria straightened to her full height, which wasn't much, but her attitude added several inches. I chair a 3-member emergency committee with authority to make binding decisions for community protection. We meet weekly to review potential threats to property values and neighborhood character. The way she said threats made it clear she was looking directly at one. So you, plus 2 other people, can override county government? I was trying to understand the logic. But Victoria interpreted my questions as challenges to her authority. Her voice climbed toward that particular pitch. That means someone's about to lose control completely. Mr. Kellerman, I've been managing this community for 4 years. I know what's best for Cedar Falls. And this trailer park cabin is not it. That's when Frank Delaney wandered over from his property next door. Frank's a retired contractor, 67 years old, with the kind of weathered hands that come from 40 years of honest work. He'd been watching our conversation with obvious interest, and Victoria's raised voice had apparently decided him to join the party. Morning. Marcus, everything okay here? Frank's timing was perfect because Victoria immediately shifted into performance mode for a larger audience. Frank, perhaps you can help, Mr. Kellerman understand community standards. This construction project threatens everyone's property values. Frank examined my building plans with the eye of someone who actually knew construction. Looks like quality work to me. Got county permits and everything? Victoria's professional mask slipped another notch. Permits don't give him the right to destroy our neighborhood character. Frank raised an eyebrow and looked around at the collection of oversized houses surrounding us. Victoria, half these places look like they belong in a strip mall. Marcus's cabin actually fits the natural setting. I could see Victoria calculating whether Frank was an ally or an enemy. She decided to try bringing him into her authority circle rather than fighting on 2 fronts. Frank, you understand property values. You know what happens when neighborhoods lose their standards? Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. I know what happens when neighbors stop being neighborly. Property values actually go up when people want to live somewhere. That's when Victoria played what she thought was her trump card. She pulled a thick envelope from her other blazer pocket and handed it to me with obvious satisfaction. Marcus Kellerman, you have 48 hours to remove all construction materials and abandon this project. Failure to comply will result in $500 daily fines plus immediate legal action. I opened the envelope and read through the official-looking documents inside. Lots of legal language, multiple signatures, and enough threats to intimidate most people into compliance. But something felt off about the whole presentation. Victoria was trying too hard to look official, like she was performing rather than simply enforcing legitimate rules. Victoria, can I see a copy of the HOA bylaws? I'd like to review the specific provisions I'm supposedly violating. Her reaction was immediate and telling. I am the bylaws in this community. 4 years of banking experience gives me the expertise to make these decisions. Frank caught my eye and shook his head slightly. Victoria's authority claims were getting more grandiose by the minute, and we both sensed something wasn't quite right about her legal foundation. I decided to test her confidence. No problem. Victoria, I'll want to review everything carefully before making any decisions. Can you provide documentation for this emergency committee you mentioned? Her face cycled through several emotions before settling on irritated impatience. Documentation? The committee operates under existing HOA authority. I don't need to justify my decisions to someone who's been here 5 minutes. Frank stepped forward with the kind of smile that means trouble for somebody. Victoria, I've been here since the beginning. I don't remember voting for any emergency committee. Victoria's professional composure cracked visibly. The committee was established under my presidential authority to handle urgent community threats. Frank nodded slowly. So you appointed yourself emergency powers to override county government. The morning was getting interesting, and I could see Victoria realizing that her intimidation tactics weren't working as planned. She'd expected me to fold immediately when faced with official-looking documents and threats of fines. Instead, she was getting questions about her authority and challenges to her legal claims. Frank's presence had turned her solo performance into an unwanted debate. Victoria made her final threat with the kind of dramatic flair that told me she'd practiced this speech. Mr. Kellerman, I've given you fair warning. 48 hours. Or I'll be forced to take action that you'll regret. She spun on her heel and marched toward her house, her high heels clicking against the gravel like an angry metronome. Frank waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. Marcus, that woman's been trouble since day one. She's forced 2 families to move away with her harassment campaigns. I folded Victoria's threats back into their envelope and looked across the lake at the peaceful water reflecting the morning sun. Frank, I've dealt with worse than Victoria Ashworth. Sometimes bullies need to be reminded that not everyone scares easily. That evening, I made the phone call that changed everything. Bobby, it's Marcus. I need some legal advice about property rights in Colorado. Judge Robert Hayes had been my grandfather's fishing buddy and my unofficial mentor since childhood. Retired federal judge, 70 years old, with the kind of sharp legal mind that had spent decades untangling complex cases. If anyone could help me understand Victoria's authority claims, it was Bobby. Marcus, good to hear from you. How's the cabin project coming? Bobby's voice carried the warmth of someone who'd watched me grow up and understood why this project mattered. I explained Victoria's threats, her emergency committee claims, and the official-looking documents she'd presented. Bobby listened without interruption, which usually meant he was already forming opinions about what he was hearing. Son, this woman's playing games with legal authority she doesn't possess. HOAs can't override county permits, and emergency committees can't be self-appointed. What you're describing sounds like someone with a banking background who understands how to make fraud look official. Bobby's words confirmed my instincts about Victoria's performance, but they also raised bigger questions about what she was really up to. Bobby, there's something else. She's been charging everyone $200 annually for lake access maintenance. Is that legitimate? The silence on Bobby's end stretched long enough that I started wondering if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, and his voice carried a tone I'd only heard when he was about to deliver devastating news to opposing counsel. Marcus, who owns the lake? It was a simple question that I realized I'd never actually considered. I assumed it was community property, or maybe county land. Bobby's chuckle held no humor. Son, you need to research Cedar Falls Lake ownership before you make any decisions about Victoria Ashworth. Trust me on this one. That night, I couldn't sleep. Bobby's question kept echoing in my mind, and I found myself staring at my grandfather's old deed documents with new curiosity. I'd inherited the property without really examining all the legal details, assuming it was just a simple land transfer. But Bobby's tone suggested there might be more to my inheritance than I'd realized. Wednesday morning found me at the Boulder County Assessor's office with a stack of paperwork and a growing suspicion that my grandfather had left me more than just a piece of lakefront property. The clerk, a patient woman named Jennifer, helped me trace the ownership history of Cedar Falls Lake back through decades of transfers and subdivisions. What I discovered made Victoria's authority claims look like a child playing dress-up. Mr. Kellerman, Jennifer said, pointing to a highlighted entry in the property records. According to these documents, Cedar Falls Lake is private property owned by an entity called Cedar Falls Properties LLC. She pulled up the corporate filing on her computer screen. The lake rights were purchased separately from the surrounding land in 1987 for $12,000. My hands were shaking as I read the purchaser's name, Thomas Kellerman. My grandfather, the man who'd brought me fishing here as a kid, who'd told stories about making the deal of a lifetime with some developer who didn't understand water rights. I'd thought those were just old man's tales about outsmarting city slickers. Turns out, Grandpa had been dead serious. Jennifer, what happens to corporate ownership when the sole proprietor dies? She consulted another screen and smiled. If the property was transferred through inheritance, the new owner would need to update the corporate filing. But the ownership rights transfer automatically with the estate. The implications hit me like a freight train. I didn't just own the land around Cedar Falls Lake. I owned the entire 47-acre lake itself. Driving home with a folder full of documentation, I started laughing for the first time in months. Victoria Ashworth had been charging 31 families $200 annually for access to water that belonged to me. She'd been collecting fees for maintenance. She had no authority to perform on property she didn't control. Even better, she'd been threatening to restrict my lake access to water I actually owned. Frank was working in his yard when I pulled into my driveway, and something about my expression must have caught his attention. "Marcus, you look like someone who just won the lottery." I walked over with the property documents, still grinning. "Frank, want to hear something interesting about our lake access fees?" When I explained what I'd discovered, Frank's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. First disbelief, then amazement, then the kind of slow smile that comes with realizing justice is about to be served. "Marcus, you're telling me Victoria's been charging us to access your lake?" I nodded and showed him the corporate documents. "For 4 years. She's collected almost $25,000 in unauthorized fees." Frank shook his head in wonder. "That explains why she's so desperate to control lake access. She's been running a scam, and your cabin project threatens to expose it." We stood there looking across the water, and I started forming a plan for how to handle Victoria's next move, because there was definitely going to be a next move. Right on schedule. Victoria appeared at my property Thursday morning with 2 men in hard hats and an official-looking woman carrying a clipboard. "Marcus Kellerman, meet County Inspector Davis. She's here to investigate safety violations in your construction project." Victoria's confidence had returned overnight, and she was clearly playing what she thought was her ace in the hole. Inspector Davis approached my building site with professional thoroughness, examining the foundation work and reviewing my permits. "Mr. Kellerman, I received a complaint about blocked emergency access routes. Can you show me your site plans?" I spread my architectural drawings on the tailgate while Victoria hovered nearby like a prosecutor waiting for a conviction. "Miss Ashworth claims your cabin blocks emergency vehicle access to the lake." Inspector Davis continued. "She's provided documentation showing a designated emergency route through this area." Victoria produced another folder of official-looking papers, and I could see she'd spent considerable time preparing this ambush. I examined Victoria's emergency access documents with genuine curiosity. They looked impressive, with county letterhead and official signatures, but something felt wrong about the dates and approval processes. "Inspector Davis, can you verify these emergency designations in your system?" Victoria's confidence flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Those documents speak for themselves." Inspector Davis pulled out her tablet and started cross-referencing Victoria's papers with county records. The silence stretched uncomfortably while Victoria shifted her weight and her 2 hard-hat companions exchanged glances. Finally, Inspector Davis looked up with obvious confusion. "Miss Ashworth, I can't find any record of approved emergency access routes through this property." Victoria's face went through several color changes before she managed to speak. "That's impossible. I submitted those requests personally in 2019. Inspector Davis continued searching her database. "Ma'am, I see submission records, but new approvals. Emergency access designations require multiple department sign-offs, environmental studies, and landowner consent." The trap was closing, and Victoria could feel it. But what about community safety? Emergency vehicles need lake access. I decided it was time to play my cards. "Inspector Davis, Before we discuss emergency access, could you help clarify who has authority over lake access in general? Victoria shot me a sharp look, suddenly realizing this conversation was heading somewhere dangerous. Inspector Davis consulted her records again. Lake access depends on ownership. If it's public water, county manages access. If it's private property, the owner controls access. Victoria jumped in immediately. It's community property managed through the HOA. I reached into my folder and pulled out the corporate documents. Actually, Inspector, I think you'll find the lake is private property. The silence that followed was absolute. Inspector Davis examined my ownership papers with growing amazement, while Victoria's confident expression melted into pure panic. Mr. Kellerman, according to these documents, you own Cedar Falls Lake through inheritance of Cedar Falls Properties, LLC. Victoria's face had gone completely white. That's impossible, Victoria whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Inspector Davis handed the documents back to me with obvious respect. Sir, these corporate filings appear legitimate. If you own the lake, you have exclusive authority over access and usage. Victoria was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Frank had been watching from his yard, and Victoria's reaction drew him over to witness her meltdown. Victoria, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. She turned toward Frank with desperate eyes. This can't be legal. I've been managing lake access for 4 years. I have authority. I kept my voice gentle but firm. Victoria, what authority? You've been charging fees for property you don't control, claiming powers you don't possess, and filing false emergency access requests. Each word hit her like a physical blow. Inspector Davis was taking notes, and Victoria's helpers were backing away from the conversation. Inspector Davis, Victoria said, making one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. Surely there are environmental protections, wetland regulations, something that gives the community rights to this water. Inspector Davis shook her head. Ma'am, private lakes aren't subject to public access requirements. The owner has complete control unless they've granted easements. That's when Victoria made the mistake that sealed her fate. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911 while we all watched. Emergency services? I need police response immediately. There's a man threatening community safety and blocking emergency access. Her voice carried the hysteria of someone watching their world collapse in real time. 15 minutes later, Deputy Sarah Chen arrived to find Victoria pacing frantically while I sat calmly on my tailgate drinking coffee. Ma'am, you called about threatening behavior? Victoria pointed at me dramatically. That man is claiming to own our community lake and threatening to cut off emergency access. Deputy Chen looked at Inspector Davis, who provided a quick summary of the situation. Deputy, Mr. Kellerman has provided documentation showing he owns the lake through corporate inheritance. Miss Ashworth has been filing complaints based on emergency access routes that were never officially approved. Victoria interrupted desperately. He can't just own a lake. What about community rights? What about property values? Deputy Chen examined my ownership documents with the thoroughness of someone who dealt with property disputes before. Ma'am, private property ownership is pretty straightforward. If his documents are legitimate, he has full ownership rights. Frank stepped forward with information that made Victoria's situation even worse. Deputy, there's something else you should know. Victoria's been charging all the neighbors $200 a year for lake access maintenance. Deputy Chen raised an eyebrow. Charging fees for property she doesn't own? The math was devastating, and Victoria knew it. 31 families times $200 times 4 years equaled almost $25,000 in unauthorized collections. I used that money for community improvements. Victoria protested, but she couldn't provide specifics when Deputy Chen asked for examples. Miss Ashworth, Deputy Chen said with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child, collecting fees for services you have no authority to provide could constitute fraud. Victoria's last hope was crumbling, and her voice climbed toward complete hysteria. This is insane. You can't let him destroy our community. I decided to show some mercy. Deputy Chen, I don't want to press charges. Victoria clearly believed she had authority, even if she was mistaken. Victoria looked shocked by my restraint. but Deputy Chen was already taking notes about the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed. Mr. Kellerman, that's generous of you, but filing false emergency reports is a separate issue. Deputy Chen continued. Miss Ashworth, this is your second call about the same property in 3 days. Both calls involved claims that turned out to be unfounded. Victoria was trapped, and she knew it. By afternoon, word had spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Mrs. Patterson from across the street knocked on my door with obvious excitement. Marcus, is it true? Do you really own the lake? When I confirmed the story, her reaction was immediate and heartfelt. That means Victoria's been stealing from us for years. The community response was swift and decisive. By evening, I had neighbors lining up to thank me for exposing Victoria's scam and asking about refunds for their illegally collected fees. Mr. Torres, a quiet man who lived 2 houses down, spoke for everyone when he said, Marcus, we trusted her because she seemed so official. Thank you for finding the truth. Saturday brought the emergency HOA meeting that would end Victoria's reign permanently. She'd called the meeting to address the crisis, but she hadn't counted on the entire community knowing about her fraud by then. When 31 households gathered in Frank's backyard, the mood was decidedly hostile toward their former president. Victoria arrived last, clearly hoping to control the narrative, but the community had already reached their own conclusions. Ladies and gentlemen, she began with desperate authority. We're facing an unprecedented threat to our property values and community standards. The audience response was immediate and unanimous, silence that spoke volumes about her lost credibility. I stood up with my folder of documents and addressed the crowd. Neighbors, I think everyone deserves to understand what's really been happening with our HOA fees. When I explained the lake ownership situation and Victoria's unauthorized fee collection, the anger was palpable. Voices rose demanding immediate refunds and Victoria's resignation. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived in the community longest, delivered the final blow. Victoria, my husband and I have paid you $800 over 4 years for lake maintenance. You never maintained anything. You just took our money. The crowd's murmur of agreement sealed Victoria's fate. The vote was 30-1 in favor of accepting Victoria's immediate resignation and demanding full refunds of all unauthorized fees. Only Victoria voted against the motion, and even her 2 emergency committee allies abandoned her when they realized the legal implications of supporting fraud. 3 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Victoria's front yard. Frank knocked on my door that evening with the news that she'd accepted the first offer and would be gone within the month. Marcus, I heard she's moving back to Phoenix. Probably figured Colorado winters are too cold for someone with her reputation. The final twist came when Bobby called with information from his federal contacts. Marcus, turns out your friend Victoria was running the same scam in 3 other Colorado communities. The FBI is investigating her for systematic HOA fraud. Justice had a longer reach than any of us had imagined. 6 months later, Cedar Falls had transformed into the community it was always meant to be. I eliminated all of Victoria's arbitrary rules, reduced HOA fees to $50 annually for actual maintenance, and opened free lake access to all residents. Property values increased 18% as word spread about our reasonable HOA management. My cabin became the community gathering spot Victoria had feared, hosting barbecues and fishing tournaments that brought neighbors together instead of driving them apart. The lake that had been a source of conflict became a symbol of healing, where children learned to fish and families rediscovered what it means to be genuine neighbors. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well, surrounded by people who understand that community means cooperation, not control. What would you have done in my situation? Share your HOA nightmare stories below because, trust me, there are more Victoria Ashworths out there than you'd think.